Welcome everybody to the Conscious Grief series, and today I am delighted to be with Katie Brindle, Chinese medicine practitioner and founder of the Hayo'u method. So thank you so much, Katie, for being here today.
You're very welcome, Tara. It's an absolute delight.
So my first question to get started is, how would you define grief?
Well, I guess how I would define it is how I've understood the Chinese masters have always been defining it, which is grief is an emotion, which is in our medicine aligned to the lung energy, and it aligns itself to sadness, grief, and loss. So it can be loss of a human life, which is probably the way most people think of it, but it's also loss of a loved one. It could be a period of your life. It could be a thing. It could be your childhood. You could be stuck in a pattern of kind of wanting to be permanently 16. It could be the loss of, say, divorce. It could be the loss of anything. So grief can even hit you when you've, say, been burgled and you've lost dear possessions, sort of not necessarily a telly, but, I don't know, like an heirloom or something of sentimental value. So, and the whole emotion, that feeling of loss, is held inside the lungs. And I think the other one thing to say is that this concept of letting go is very much aligned into the lungs and that process of grief. And interestingly, it is actually one of the most difficult emotions to process in the human body, which immediately starts to make it terribly interesting, because we have, in my opinion, not a very good way of dealing with grief I'm in England right now, so having lived abroad and lived in other cultures and observed how they process grief, it's very, very different. And I don't necessarily think that the way we're handling it is quite as optimum as it could be. So it's why it's such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. And I would love to hear a little bit more about your own personal relationship with grief and losses that you've had in your own life.
So it's a really good question. I have suffered a lot of, if I rephrase the word grief as loss, because I think that's probably it's an easier way to express the full remit of the emotion. Because the thing about grief is that we normally think of it and we think, oh, the loss of a mother or the loss of a child. It's a human loss is where we tend to think it. But actually, grief is about loss and letting go. And I have many examples in my life where I have either successfully managed to let go, and I have also successfully managed to navigate grief, and also not successfully managed to navigate grief. And it's happened to me in many different ways and guises. So the obvious example was, very sadly, my mother died when she was 63, and she'd been fighting cancer since she was about 47, which is, interestingly, I'm now 48. So, and I mean, that was a kind of defining process of observing someone I loved very much, basically suffering, from when I was about 80. I can't remember exactly how old I was 16, 18, I don't know. I was at school. I can't remember really. I was probably doing GCSEs, but the beginning of the end, and the long drawn out process of that loss of life. That was kind of one really good example. But then there was another really good example when I lost my vocation. So when I had my car accident, which was kind of a big shock in my body, this is when I was in my very early 20s, and I wanted to be an opera singer. Now, actually, in hindsight, I wouldn't have made it anyway, actually, is the truth. I don't think. I mean, who knows? It's a good story to pretend I would have done, isn't it? Because no one can prove it. It's like elephant powder, isn't it? Well, but but the truth is, I don't think I would have made it if, in my heart of hearts, I think I'm much better at talking than singing. But at that time, I didn't know that. And I lost my vocation. I lost my identity. And then I went into grief because I lost all what was familiar to me. And that, I think, is what happens when we go into extreme loss, which is full on grief. I think that's half the problem. We feel completely disorientated because we don't know what to hold on to and what to let go. And I think what's really interesting about the Chinese viewpoint of this, if I may paraphrase slightly, is that because grief is attributed to the lungs in our theory, then what happens is the lungs are the organ which is the most exterior. It's the organ right up at the top of the body. It's the one that has the biggest relationship with the outside world, because you're inhaling the outside world and then letting go. So this process of what you hold on to and what you let go of is right there, second by second, as the human being exists. So when you go into full-on grief, it's that shock where you kind of go,
yeah.
I'm just going to tap my lungs to let go of that. But that's what you do emotionally. Okay. And that's what I did when I had that car crash. Okay. That with my mother, it was different because it was a long drawn out process of suffering. And I didn't have the shock. I have to say, when I lost my mother, whilst I mourned and grieved her, I know that I don't want to sound like I don't want to make saying this the wrong way. I was actually relieved. If I'm being really honest with you, it's quite hard to actually say that, to say I was relieved, because she was in so much pain. It was awful it was so hard to nurse her in those final months of her life. She was just, it was horrendous. So horrendous that actually I found the end process merciful. And actually it took me into a really interesting new dimension of learning about how to process grief and how to understand the passing of her physical life to her energetic life, and how to relate that back to myself and let her go simultaneously. And I went on a really interesting kind of intellectual quest to really answer and satisfy those questions, which I found hugely helpful. And actually helped me navigate probably the most extreme experience of grief that I would have had, except it had been a very long drawn out process. So I think I was grieving my mother for probably 20 years. Because this went on for a long time.
So was that a catalyst into getting into the Chinese medicine?
No. The catalyst for the Chinese, yes and no, sorry. The catalyst for Chinese medicine was the original grief, interesting, and I've never thought of it like that, was the loss and the letting go of the illusion, in my case, of being a singer. I was never going to be a singer. Okay. I was never going to make it. I know that. But I was attached to the illusion of the fact that that's what I wanted to do. And that's what I believed I could do. And it's what I desired. It's what I was aiming for. It was where my world was taking me. But the loss kicked in at that point. That's when Chinese medicine kicked in. It didn't kick in straight away. There was about a 7 or 8 year period between, I really need to write this down so I can get my facts straight. I'm constantly, is it 7 years, 8 years? I was roughly 21. And when I was roughly 28, that was when I discovered Chinese medicine, because I'd had this injury for so long. I was living a non-life, attached to the illusion of where I was and not knowing where I was going to, not knowing what to let go of, not knowing what to let in. I was in the wilderness. And then at 28, that's when I discovered Chinese medicine, and that brought in life. Okay, as I then let go fully of the illusion, in came life, and in it came in a thunderbolt of wow. Okay, inspiration. And now that's what's so interesting, because whilst the grief process is all that letting go and it's that like feeling, okay, now inspiration comes in a really amazing way, because what inspiration does is it's the inhalation of the lung energy with that joyful gratitude when you think, wow, oh my God, this is incredible. How did I not know? Enlightened state. Okay, now that also comes in with the breath. Wow. Okay, now that came in at that moment when I discovered gua sha. So I've got really itchy nose. I'm trying to find a tissue. I haven't had one. Anyway, I tried to find this really interesting kind of thing that kind of came in and hit me. And that was what gave me that ability to kind of wake up. And my lungs kind of inhaled and exhaled as this excitement and inspiration of life. And I think that's the thing to understand. The process of grief is that the process of letting go, okay, and looking forwards, as Einstein said, well, not paraphrasing entirely, but he said basically life is like a bicycle. You've got to get on and keep pedaling and going forwards. Okay, and that was what I learned, that suddenly out of this abyss of nothing, of death, of the death of an illusion, of the death of an expectation. And yes, there was a 7 or 8 year kind of chasm between the two, but then finally in came this enlightened state, which literally just like blew my mind. It took my breath away to go back into the lungs again. And that was the beginning. But that was what took me into becoming a practitioner. I was doing massage and reflexology, then acupuncture. And it wasn't until my mother died that was that sort of second big expression of grief. That's the loss of a human, a loved one, a dear one, you know, a matriarch, really important person in my life. And it's at that point that I discovered the kind of the psycho-emotional aspect of Chinese medicine, which is probably, I would say, my favorite bit. If I'm really, I mean, I love it all so much, but that's the bit that I really, hence why we're talking, because the minute I heard what you would do, I was like, oh God, yes, so interesting, fascinating. Yes, I want to do that. So, and there it was, a rebirth.
Mm-hmm.
There
So
it is,
tell
the
a little
rebirth.
bit more about how Chinese medicine can help people that are grieving, for example.
Oh, well, the first thing to identify with grief that I love about Chinese medicine is that it locates the problem in the body. Now, that's a huge relief to actually even understand that there's a location. It's not mental health. In Chinese medicine, mental health isn't a thing. Okay, we look at the body in a slightly different way. It doesn't mean to say that other ways are not right or wrong. It's just a different approach. It still gets you to the end point, but we look at it from the body. We recognize that the body is ruled by these 5 key organs, which are held in what we call the 5 elements. And that is the heart, the spleen, the lungs, the kidneys, and the liver. Okay. And each one of those organs are like kingdoms, and they're responsible for your biology, for your physical health, for your emotional health, and for your spiritual health. Now, when we're dealing with grief, it's an emotion. Okay. But we normally experience painful emotions in the body because they are there to teach us lessons. We learn through pain. And I hate saying that, because I really wish we didn't. I wish I could go, oh no, we don't. All pain, let's just all like make a pact and we'll all get rid of pain. We don't need pain. But the truth is, we do learn our toughest lessons through pain, because it means that the blade, you see, the metal, the lung is about grief. The lung is aligned to the metal element. The metal element in Chinese medicine is the knife, but it's also the jewel. It's the genie in the lamp. It's the kingdom of heaven, or the heavenly realm above us, the breath, the insubstantial, but it's also the diamond inside the earth, the very essence of what makes you who you are, and the whole of your spirit and everything that you're inhaling and exhaling and everything in between. Okay, so it's really interesting. It's like the human being at the most, the genie outside the lamp, with, you know, able to grant 3 wishes, compressed down into this little lamp, which is kind of the essence of the DNA within the human, the spirit, the uniqueness of the self. And we learn through these painful experiences in life. And the thing that we learn through these experiences, when we learn to navigate them properly, is compassion. Yeah. Now, this is interesting because compassion is housed in the liver, and that's the wood element. And in Chinese medicine, when you look at these 5 elements, metal, which is the lungs, controls wood. Okay, which means that this divinity that's sitting within our lungs and these painful experiences, of which we know, because the masters have taught us, that grief is the hardest of these emotions to process. It's the toughest one, which is why what you're doing is so amazing. It controls wood. It controls the blueprint of the soul, which is the liver. Okay, and therefore and the liver is responsible for compassion. So one of the most beautiful things you can ever do as a human is to say to someone else, I know how you feel. Yeah. I have experienced that pain. I know that feel. I know that resonance. My story isn't the same as your story, but we, before we've even properly met before today, have both lost parents. Right, which means I know how you feel. Mm-hmm. And now when you are aligning yourself to someone suffering, because you can then offer them kindness and compassion, because you can align yourself to their deepest pain, that is the greatest gift any human being can offer another. That you cannot possibly ask for any more of a person to have suffered on your behalf. And it really starts to bring meaning into why we have these awful experiences, because it offers the opportunity to give of your spirit in the most exquisite way, which is, of course, what the energy of the divinity that sits in the lungs is all about. Letting go, allowing in, processing, breathing in inspiration and support and help and divinity into each other, and to develop each other's spirits and our kind of collective wisdom and consciousness. And that's what I love so much about this system, because it puts it into the physical body and yet expresses it in a way that, although it might sound a bit weird when you first start, you might need to listen to this twice, actually is full of enlightenment and hope and support and love, which is so wonderful.
It really is. And I often sometimes ask people what they think the gift of grief are. And I think you've really encapsulated that in your last answer. So thank you so much, Katie. I mean, it's just so wonderful to hear all of this knowledge about the body and the Chinese medicine. It's quite remarkable. And then there was one other, because so often, and you did say this in your first answer, but we often think of grief related, you know, we hear the word grief and we think death, but actually of a person. It's so many more things that happen in our life that we grieve over, the losses. And you also had a journey with fertility difficulties. How was that for you? Because I know a lot of people who are having difficulty with fertility problems and maybe not being as compassionate with themselves as they could be, you know, through that process.
Fertility is really hard. So I guess I've got quite a lot of experiences around this. Interestingly, when I naturally and easily, effortlessly fell pregnant with my first daughter. And actually, it was so easy and effortless that I went into total shock because I was not ready. I was 31 at the time, and I felt like a teenage pregnancy. I know it sounds ridiculous, but none of my friends had even settled down, never mind thinking about having children. I was sort of sat there on my own, sort of feeling like, oh my goodness. And the interesting thing around grief on that one is my mum was an amazing woman, but she'd been abused as a child. She'd had a really horrible life, and she didn't want children. And she used to say to my sister and I all the time, I never wanted children, I never wanted children. Now that created a state of grief in my body, because that made me feel unwanted. Even though she didn't mean it. She didn't mean I didn't love you. What she meant was, she, as a woman of the kind of 40s and 50s, just felt trapped by the fact she was forced into parenting at sort of 23 years old, and her life had sort of stopped, because that's what it was like for a woman in those days. What she was grieving was the loss of her life as an individual, because she lost it. So that had all imbued itself into me as her child. So of course I grew up thinking, well, I never understood the point of children, if I'm really honest with you. All I could see was kind of screaming nightmares, having been indoctrinated by my own mother, I never wanted you, and me going, well, therefore I don't want, why would I want that? And then I fell pregnant. Then I went into grief and shock myself at the loss of my life. I just got married. We were planning all this amazing stuff we were going to do, and it all went like, then suddenly my head was down a toilet for 9 months, and that was the end of that. And then in came this gorgeous child, and then of course all changed. But when I was giving birth, we had to have an emergency cesarean, and I was in a lovely, very, very, very lovely hospital. They were brilliant there, and they offered me grief counselling because I lost the ability to give birth. They offered that to me, and they said, it was amazing. They were really, really enlightened, and they said, you've lost the ability as a woman to experience what that process feels like of like bringing a body into the world. It was done in the passive tense. Now, actually, interestingly, I think I have quite a healthy relationship with many of these emotions, partly because of what I know and partly because of my nature, I guess. I was just grateful to be alive. I mean, you know, it was also touch and go at the time. And I was so in love with this baby that I just kind of didn't think. Now, then the grief kicked in again, because, of course, then sort of 18 months later, assuming I could effortlessly get pregnant, and then suddenly finding actually I could not at all. Then in came all the rounds of IVF. Right, now in came the grief, every missed period, every missed cycle, every cycle of sitting and not being able to go and do things. Like, by this point, all my friends are now getting married. I'm having to miss everything because I'm having endless cycles of this, that, and the other. And the grief whenever every single time it failed. And then I did get pregnant with twins, and then I miscarried. Grief. And then I was nursing my mother at the same time. It was just everything was just kind of getting to that dead end, and it was awful. And then finally we went down the donor egg route, and it did work. And then in the process I lost my mother and all these other things. It was all intertwined. And I think the thing from all of this was that I learned a lot about loss at that time. Again, the loss of hope. And again, what I found really helpful in that process was that when you're going through kind of mini grief, which is what I described that, because you're losing the possibility of a baby, it like the miscarriage was grief, because they would develop children by that stage, and that was the end of that. And I lost my mother, and I'd had multiple rounds of things not working before, so that was that sort of mini process going on. And the way that I combated that and found really helpful was to go again into the wood. Metal controls wood, but if the wood is strong, the metal can't cut it down. So if you've got some massive great oak tree and you're attacking it with a pickaxe, it's going to take a huge amount of effort to knock down that tree. Okay. So what I found really helpful was to have a really long plan. And the plan sits in the wood. And the plan was, round one, this is what we're going to do. If it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, we go to plan B. Okay. Plan B, what are we doing? Plan C, plan D. And my plan went all the way on to Z. Okay. Now, if the donor eggs hadn't worked, I was already lined up with the next. I was already 2 steps ahead in my plan. So that I could cope with the process and immediately move to the next stage. Because I think the thing about grief and letting go is that when you learn to let go, which is what is being required when you let go, grief is letting go, okay? And when you learn to let go, the way to let go is to focus on the new potential. What are you going to bring in then? Because when you let go, you create space. And as the Taoist masters say, you cannot fill an already full cup. So if your cup is full of grief and mourning and retrospection and looking backwards, there's nothing can come in because it's full, right? So therefore what you do is you have to let go of that and move forwards, right? Next phase, next phase, next phase, next phase. And the other thing that I would do is having now, I've now got a huge family. So I've got a foster son, I've got an adopted daughter, a DNA biological daughter, and donor egg twins from my husband's DNA that were carried by me. So I think I've covered all bases. And I came from a situation where I had secondary infertility, and it looked like, you know, being a mother to a single child, that was my lot. But I used my creative energy of my wood to think creatively about my situation and to understand that the universal love which sits in the heart and love of children is a wonderful thing. And letting go of perhaps my ego attaching itself to my DNA and going, no, I want to reproduce my DNA. I'm like, no, I don't. Not necessarily. I mean, I'm okay with that. Do I need my DNA? No, not really. Life is about the souls come to your work. Souls will come to you, but it's just depending about how far out you're prepared to extend the breath to draw them in. Now, I've ended up with 5 souls in my life. And I think if I'm honest with you, only one of them, if I'd have been quite constrained in my breath. So if my lungs are just going, la, da, 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 I'm going to bring in one energy. But if I go deep breath, full potential, okay, actually, there's quite a lot I can do here. There's quite a lot I can fill my empty cup with, actually. And I've ended up filling it with 5 children, not one. Hence why I was late. Dealing with my full cup.
Overflowing cup, I should imagine.
It was slightly overflowing, but it's a very useful, and I'm not saying it's easy. That's the other thing to say about this. Just because I'm explaining it in a system that I find makes sense to me, I am not, and I'm slightly paraphrasing it for the purpose of a half-hour interview, I am not saying this is easy. I'm not saying that letting go is easy. It's not easy at all. As the Taoist masters have said, it is the hardest thing to do. But let me tell you what I've learned in my life and what I've learned from what I've studied is that when something is hard, it's because it's valuable. And that's such an important lesson in life, to understand that the spiritual gain that you gain from these really difficult things that we journey in our life is there because it's supposed to be hard, because it's got huge value attached to it. Like Andy Murray winning Wimbledon, like the reason we were gunning for him and Tin Henman and it's so painful is because it's hard. I know Sampras and Federer can do it, but when it's a Brit, it's really difficult. And we're all glued to Wimbledon. Go on, Tim, go on, Andy. You know, and it meant something when they did it because it's really difficult. And it's the same for all of us. These things are really hard. These spiritual lessons are really difficult, which is why it's so brilliant that you're doing what you do to try and help people. And normally what happens is we do help people through pain. You've come into exactly what you're doing because you've suffered. That's a really big deal to be able to try and help other people out of that feeling. It's a really amazing aspect of human nature, and it's the nicest possible aspect of what makes mankind, as opposed to man horrible, which is what we see an awful lot of evidence about at the moment.
I know. What do you think it is about, talking about sort of British tennis, what do you think it is about British culture, or maybe Western culture, I should say, that we're quite grief avoidant?
Okay, so it's a bit of a tricky question, that one. There's a lot of cultural appropriation going on at the moment, and it's very difficult. It's very important to not make stereotypes. I've just got to caveat my answer with that, and I don't now want to say but and then make a stereotype. So let me go back about 150 years when national identities were perhaps much more articulated than they are now, because what I'm delighted to see in identities of nations is much more of a integration of diversity, which and the good thing of that is that brings cultural diversity and appreciation, bring in an enlightened state of going, actually many people live in this country who approach things in many different ways. We have many religions, many cultures, and that's a great thing. So if I'm talking to a UK based culture, okay, then let's go back about 150 years ago when it was quite specific about what that identity was, okay? And it's not necessarily an identity I'm particularly proud of, but that sort of stiff upper lip British Empire, which is what that was, okay? And the thing about British Empire is that immediately includes Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in it. And actually, being of Celtic origin myself, and having been to funerals and things in Scotland and in Ireland, I can say without question that they approach things in an entirely different way. So if we just specify this now down to colonial England of 150 years ago, snapshot in time, so Victorian England, it was because there was a very rigid social structure that then, thank God, started to dissolve, and now we're in a very different situation now. But I think we are still living in a sort of general hangover of that time, when basically people were expected to behave in a certain manner. It was considered not acceptable to show your emotions. You know, it was the kind of this sort of rigid structure of the British Empire, and that's how it was, and that's what's made us great, and blah, blah, blah. And you think, well, actually 150 years has now gone by, if not longer. And, you know, it's no longer the case. There are huge, great swathes of people within the British Isles who approach grief in an entirely healthy way. For example, having a wake, is something that happens in the British Isles, and it's a very healthy thing because it gives you an opportunity to process. And I know for a fact, when I use it, my own example of my expression, which was my mother, and she was buried in England, but we have quite a mishmash in my family. We're quite, I don't even know, we're a very diverse lot. And I drew in all sorts of different aspects to make her passing something that we could process. I'd start before, between her death, well, I knew she was dying. I mean, we you know, the writing was on the wall. I was using that time to already prepare. I was reading amazing books, which I found hugely helpful, about how to process the grief for myself, how to assist her in her passing, how to then translate that to the community of people at her funeral, how to make her funeral a celebration of her life. We had a huge, great celebration. I mean, everyone was sad, but we made it poignant. You know, we brought in ways to make people express their emotion in the church, and when we were doing the ceremony, we allowed the opportunity of people to express themselves with music, with crying, with poignancy, in a way to allow emotions to express. And I think one thing that I love about studying other cultures is observing different ways that people do process emotions, because I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And that is, hopefully, whilst cultural appropriation is something that is being rightfully condemned, and diversity is something which is now so inherent in the modern culture, in this new age that we're going into, it is so important to be appropriate and appreciative of other cultures and learning from each other and go, actually, that's a really good thing to do. Actually, I'm going to use that. That's helpful. I mean, that's what my entire life is about, looking at Chinese wisdom. I mean, why Chinese wisdom, Katie? You're not Chinese. It's like, well, I don't know. It's really interesting. I find it fascinating and helpful. So and it's not just that. I mean, you know, I used to live in Mexico. I went to a funeral in Mexico. I found it hugely helpful to observe what they did. And it helped form, it facilitated my relationship to grieving my mother and allowing that process to take place.
Thank you so much, Katie. And the last question before we wrap up. What do you think conscious grief looks like?
Do you know what? I have to say, a bit of a smart ass over here. I didn't understand what that question meant. What is conscious grief? Just enlighten me what that even is, and then I'll see if I can answer the question.
Well, how would you say, instead of, like, because I personally felt that I was unconsciously not dealing with my grief for many years by just not being emotional, trying to be strong, I just didn't want to sort of be feeling the pain and the sadness. So I'm thinking of ways that we can more consciously grieve, how we can lean into grief, and whether it's through talking about it in interviews like this, whether it's through more movement, you know, having different modalities to help us. It's a very broad question.
Okay, I get it. So really interesting, because of course Chinese medicine to the rescue. It's so brilliant. So the first thing to say is that grief is an emotion. It is a state of emotion, and it is what we would consider to be the sort of the negative emotion of the lung. And when you understand Chinese self-care, what you learn is something amazing called transcendent emotions. And what it means is that you attach into the physical pain of how you're feeling right now. So anyone listening to this no doubt will be feeling that pain because it lies heavy in the lungs. It even shows itself visibly. As a Chinese medicine practitioner, we observe people when they tend to hunch their shoulders, they take shallow breaths, they find it hard to finish their sentences, they've often got quite pale skin, they often find it hard to have a bowel movement because it affects the lower colon, and they catch colds easily. All of these things are shown like in physical movements. And what you learn to do is transcend the state. So what you do is you transcend the state of grief or loss into gratitude. Okay, gratitude is the high virtue of the lung. And what you find is if you breathe into the resonance of the pain, because we know it's in the lung, and then you can start to feel the vibration of gratitude. Now, it's really hard when you start. I am not saying it's easy. It is not easy at all. You don't feel grateful at all when you're in that state. So what I suggest to people is write a gratitude list. So to start to get gratitude into your life and getting that feeling into the body, you literally get yourself a nice book, which is a precious, but it doesn't have to be expensive. It's just sacred because you've decided it's pink or it's glittery or it's black or it's red. It doesn't matter. It's just sacred. And you write down everything you're grateful for, every single thing you can think of. The leaves in spring, the camellia bush outside my front gate, you know, my lunch, which I actually haven't had today, you know, my doggy in the bed in the morning having a cuddle, you know, teaching qigong, talking to you, like anything, like lighting that candle, saying grace before you eat food, being appreciative. Gratitude is the highest one of the highest kind of human virtues. And what you do is the more you focus on the gratitude, the more the grief will abate and it will subside. And then what happens is you start to transform that negative emotion that's pulling you down and making you feel very pessimistic because you're stuck and lost and just destroyed by the loss of what you've lost, and it's never coming back, and it's just completely overwhelming. But what happens with life is life will always go on. Now, you might not be ready to go with it, but it does, and that's the natural order of things. And gratitude starts to kind of be like fertilizer on the green shoots of possibility of fresh expression. Okay, I will never get back the twins that I lost. Okay, I will never get back my mother, but new life has come through. I got new twins. I then inherited 2 other children. I got 4 children. So these souls came in new life. You know, when we lost our beloved dog, I mean, my husband was absolutely distraught. And then the first thing I did, I got a new puppy literally the next day. And then he didn't know what to do because he was destroyed with the loss of this. He loved this dog so much. And then I picked up this black Labrador puppy and placed this 12 week old puppy into the arms of my husband. He literally didn't know how. He was crying so much. Oh, it's making me cry to think about it, because how could you not love this new thing in your body? It was this beautiful God-given creature, and my husband just sobbed into this puppy for about 6 hours non-stop. Literally didn't know. Oh my God, it's literally making me cry to think about it. It was so lovely. But life moves on and these new things come through, and it does pass, and it will. It's gratitude is the way to get there. Gratitude and a plan and being kind to yourself, and slowly. And if it's really hard, then the thing is to get that, write down the gratitude, perhaps with a friend, with a loved person who can sit there with you, go right, and you go, I don't feel, I'm not gratitude for anything. Come on, there must be something. Come on, something. What do you like the most? Okay, I like red wine. Okay, fine. What's your favorite red wine? I don't know. I like a Burgundy. Okay, right. Which brand? Right. Okay, right. And you get there. You've got to dig deep. Okay, but it slowly but surely works you through. It does. And the other thing, just to answer the physical thing, is that drumming the lungs, drumming really works, because the thing about understanding that physical and emotional pain are intertwined in Chinese medicine, it gives you a physical location to actually work. Drumming the body, drumming the lungs particularly. This is why people beat their chests when they're grief stricken. They do it on purpose. That's why we have this wisdom in the past, because it moves the emotion. It helps you take in the breath and starts to try and build yourself back up. And it does work. You don't have to forget, but it is about allowing the heart, which is held in the lungs, to start to love again.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is the main message, isn't it? To keep the heart open so that we can stay in our loving.
Yeah.
And in our fullness of life. Katie, I have just loved speaking to you. I'm so grateful for everything, all your wisdom that you share. It's just quite incredible. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a joy to talk about such a beautiful subject and such a painful subject. So thank you so much for doing what you do. It's brilliant. Thank you.